Hello, this is a talk called The Resacralization of the Planet, and I've adapted it from a chapter on my new book called Through the Gateway, an exploration of a new story for humanity. And I want to preface this chapter by just mentioning something. Satish Kumar, a wonderful Indian man, wrote a book called Spiritual Compass, and he talked about three states in it: the sattvic state, the rajasic state, and the tamasic state. The sattvic state, when I refer to it in this talk, is the state of living in a sacred way, of living in harmony with the planet, of living in a balanced way, honouring the earth, respecting our fellow human beings, being a planetary citizen. That's the sattvic way, respecting a small footprint on the earth, which is the sacred path. The second way is the rajasic way, which is the way our society or the system operates. In other words, it's dysfunctional. In other words, there's imbalance, there's separation, there's pain, there's the world doesn't work. That's the rajasic way. That's the system that we're born into. And the third way is the tamasic, and the rajasic can often descend into the tamasic, because the tamasic is what happens when evil comes into being. It's a step lower than the rajasic. The rajasic is the normal. The tamasic is Aleppo, the bombing, the fire bombing, the petrol bombing of the citizens of Aleppo. It's evil, it's Auschwitz, it's Darfur, it's the large multinational companies that come and take over and wipe out the well-being of the local inhabitants. So I just wanted to give you that background, because I'm going to be talking about these states. So it's the sattvic, the rajasic, and the tamasic. So here we go, the resacralization of the planet. And I'm going to start with some quotes, because I like quotes. This is one by the great scholar Mircea Eliade. Desacralization pervades the entire experience of the non-religious man of modern societies, and with the rise of patriarchal religions, this sense of containment within the sacred order began to fade. Thomas More: when soul is neglected, it doesn't just go away. It appears symptomatically in obsessions, addictions, violence, and loss of meaning. Without soul, whatever we find will be unsatisfying. Diarmid O'Murchu, from his book Quantum Theology, he says, to reclaim the sacred nature of the cosmos, and of the planet Earth in particular, is one of the outstanding spiritual challenges of our time. And my last quote, by the wonderful Matthew Fox, who's written books on the mystical traditions of Christianity: when a civilization loses its meaning of soul, it's coming to an end. I feel our civilization has lost its meaning of soul some time ago. But that's the bad news. The good news is when we can come to new images of soul, for then we're creating a new civilization. Okay. The great malady of the 20th century is implicated in all our troubles and affecting us individually and socially, I believe, is the loss of soul. When cultures remain identified with a deficient ego, fixated in a mindset with little motivation to find their souls, these cultures start falling apart. And that's exactly what's happening in the world today. The Rajasic mindset, which has its tentacles into so much of how the world functions, has very little soul to it. And the Tamasic mindset, that world has no soul. It's everything that the military-industrial complex stands for, and it's the ultimate rape of soul. When we tear down our rainforests and overconsume, why we spend so much time only focusing on the materialistic and we try to solve our conflicts through killing is because of a lack of imagination. And the reason for this is that there's not enough soul. So another way of describing what's wrong with our world today is to say that it's a desouled world. Our old stories, the Rajasic stories that we've been reared in, have enabled us to desanctify our world, suck sacred meaning out of all areas of life. And I think one of the main symptoms of our soullessness is the fact that we have few sacred rituals in our mainstream cultures, and our churches no longer hold sacred energy, and the religion they mostly offer us is arid, joyless and uninspirational, with priests today being more occupied with issues such as should homosexuality be allowed, or should women be allowed to become bishops, than really helping us find God. And I say this with some sadness, but I think it's true that with a few notable exceptions, a lot of priests today don't embody the soulfulness which they preach, and so they possess little ensouling capabilities, which I'll describe in a moment. That is the capacity to radiate soul qualities into the world, for we can't give out what we don't possess. And of course there's nothing remotely sacred in the Tomasically focused fundamentalist religions which are so prevalent all over the world today and which are all about projecting the dark side onto others. And of course in the case of the Islamists, justify you killing those who believe in a different God to yourself. Bede Griffiths, a priest and a great holy man whose life embraced both Christianity and Buddhism, said, if Christianity cannot recover its mystical traditions and teach it, it should just go out of business as it has nothing to say. However, the problem we have is that as we human beings are naturally soulful, because it's who we are, what occurs as we operate in a culture erected around soulfulness is that at the same time as we trivialize or demean or don't recognize what is truly soulful, we also tend to deify or project soul onto what has no soul. For example, we like to give sacred meaning to money and lots of it, or to which football team wins a match, or who some famous celebrity is sleeping with, or who will win the great prize in some popular reality TV shows. And the high priests and priestesses, or those whom many of us look up to and imbue with sacred qualities, are our film stars and footballers. It's not that they are not good people, I'm sure they are, but they get given an empowerment that is not really theirs. And knowledge too has become desacralized. And to quote from Syed Hossein Nasser, a great Sufi scholar, especially he tells us that knowledge has become desacralized, especially among those segments of the human race transformed by the process of modernization, with the result that bliss, which is the fruit of the union with the One and an aspect of the perfume of the sacred, has become well nigh unattainable and beyond the grasp of the vast majority of people today. And this is an important point to understand, for as I see it, it's our failure to reach up and embrace higher order spiritual energy, which can be so healing and transformational for us if we can bring it into our lives, is another reason why there's so much stress and anxiety, so many addictions, and so little joy and wonder. We don't delight in things, we don't have wonder anymore. It's also why our defenses against negative energy, and there's a lot of it around, are often so weak, because you and I are too distant from that which can truly nourish and empower us, and we're too attached to patterns or to a worldview or to a story or to a desacralized way of seeing the world, which has the power to weaken us. However, because soul is who you and I are, I've just said that, it's intrinsic to us, we're always in search of it. However, we can only get it, and this is an important point, we can only get it at the level that we're at. And so we're always looking for it in endeavours that appear to mimic it, but which in reality are not the real thing. The result is that we get taken even further from the real thing, and we close down even more. For what we do is that we play what I call substitute soul games. What do I mean by that? Here's an example. If I don't know how to unite, to really link up with and fuse my being with a person I may be trying to love, a woman I may be trying to love, I'll try to possess her, control her. Or if I can't find true inner well-being and abundance, I may devote my life trying to make a lot of money or have a lot of things, big houses, big cars. It's a substitute for soul. It's a substitute, but it's a watered down version of the real thing. And similarly, if we have difficulty in just being, B-E-I-N-G, in just being, we tend to compensate by over-egging our doing. And many workaholics are unrealized mystics. And similarly, deep down what the alcoholic really craves is not the ersatz spirit from the bottle, but genuine spirituality. But because they're still encased in a wall of scarcity and separation and don't have the structure within themselves to access the real thing, the best they can do is to find a watered down version of the real thing. For the experience, what the experience of being pissed, being sozzled does, is that it temporarily melts away the boundaries which ordinarily strongly separate us from the world outside of ourselves. So we get a kind of sense of unity, of belonging to something bigger than ourselves. But if only in a rather discombobulated sense. And the drug ecstasy does something very similar and powerful. It acts as a substitute for having a truly open heart, where we naturally experience love and joy, and we're temporarily transported into a very ecstatic state. But the sad thing is that the experience is only temporary. We don't remain there. And the price we pay is certain damage to our brain, certain damage to our endorphins. So all these substitute activities mimic soul, but they do so at a great cost. And if persevered with, can actually, my friends, take us further and further from what we most desire. So let's ask ourselves, what is soul? I see soul as the animating principle which makes living things alive and which links all of life together. And it exists not only in all of us, but in all of life, in rocks and trees and bees and plants. Indeed, in our planet as a whole and in the entire cosmos. The Platonists spoke of an animus mundi, the soul of the world, and they regarded the entire cosmos as a living being with a body, soul and spirit. Aristotle saw that an acorn grows into an oak tree because it's pulled towards its final destination by its soul. Thus my soul and your soul is not only that part of ourselves that knows what our life purpose is and what we're capable of becoming, but which, if we listen to it and heed its call, will tell us what to do at any time to best propel ourselves forward so we can actualize, so we can live out that purpose. So when something deeply touches us, whenever we connect to something that has great meaning or passion for us, or which moves us strongly, whether in the direction of pain or joy, we're making a connection to soul. I like Thomas More's suggestion that soul is not a thing, but a quality or a dimension of experiencing life and ourselves. It has to do with depth, value, relatedness, heart, and personal substance. My own experience is that we can best connect to soul through our hearts, because when our hearts in the middle here start opening, we begin accessing our depths, and it's in the depths where souls find it easiest to commune with us. And so that's why, of course, if we just live on the surface of life, a superficial life, we cannot make the connection to soul because it won't meet us there. As such, making an effort to live with an open heart and confronting our fears and resistances to doing so will do marvels for our soul life. People who are artists, poets, writers and musicians are naturally more connected to their souls as they're more intimately involved with the creative process through their hearts. And it's also through our creativity as opposed to through our productivity, i.e. just being busy, that we hear the voice of our soul. And of course, we don't have to be part of any religion to find soul. For as I just suggested, many of those who see themselves as being religious can be the most soulless of all. Now, it's not only people and rocks and trees and rivers and ants and anteaters and leopards and giraffes and rocks that have soul. So too do organizations and institutions and nations. However, the big problem today is that too many of these institutions and organizations and nations are run by people identified with Rajasic or tamasic mindsets. And so they're unable to recognize and thus energize their organization or nation's deeper soul purpose for existing. For I want to stress that soul also is connected with the idea that all of life has a greater or higher purpose to it, that every atom is imbued with intelligence. So, for example, when you or I start connecting to our souls, we start feeling, we start experiencing that there's a deeper meaning to our lives, and that we haven't just come into the world to be a success or make money or be famous, as our deficient ego might like to tell us, but we've actually come in to make a contribution in some way to society, to be part of the intelligent flow of evolution, or, as I like to put it, to be a raiser up or enhancer of the society around us in some way. So if we're connected to our own soul's purpose, it follows that we're then able to intuit the deeper soul purpose or raison d'être of the organizations we may work for, or even the profession we've chosen to be engaged with. For example, in my own little way, I try my best to have my life be a stand for the soul of psychology. And if we happen to be a president or a prime minister and we have soul, then we'll intuit the deeper destiny of our nations and be able to initiate policies with this goal in mind, remembering that the higher purpose of our community of nations will only be realized if all individual nations play their part in serving it. As such, being a world leader is a great responsibility, for we need to bear in mind that what is ultimately in the highest interest of the larger whole is also in the highest interest of the individual part, and vice versa, so that at a soul level, parts and wholes have an identical agenda, namely to be of service to each other. The damage that an individual nation or an individual organization does, not only to itself but also to the larger world community by disregarding its deeper soul purpose, and instead of honoring what is in the well-being of the whole, only thinking of what serves its own interest, is incalculable. We see an example of this today in Russia, now headed by its tamasically motivated leader Putin, a man of pretty low moral fibre, who possesses a great capacity for lying and manipulating, and who's not only dishonestly amassed a fortune in the billions, but has conspired over the years through his aggressive policies to turn his once noble country into a rogue state. And not only does the larger world community suffer, think Syria, think Ukraine, but his people are also paying the price as a result of the stringent economic sanctions currently being levied upon them. However, this is not Russia's fault. Yes, perhaps every country gets the leader that stands for something of the values of that country, but not all of Russia lives in the mindset of Putin. And the tragedy is that what Putin has done to Russia is a great tragedy, because the citizens are suffering and the larger world community has suffered. But you can't do anything else, because if soul has not come alive inside us, if I can't feel soul inside me, I won't be able to recognize it in you or in another person I work with or in my nation or in the organization. In other words, you and I can't give life to something outside of ourselves that we've not first given life to inside of ourselves. So this therefore reinforces my whole point, that only a higher consciousness, inclusive of the domain of soul, is capable of transforming the story underlying the behaviors of certain organizations and nations. And this can't be legislated from above. You can't tell a rogue individual organization or nation to see the light and reform your ways. You can't say to Putin, behave honorably, stop lying, stop your aggression, honor the soul of your great nation embodied by men like Tolstoy and Solzhenitsyn. You'll just be laughed at and seen as naive. However, the best world leaders do embody the souls of their country. I think Gandhi embodied the soul of India, and Churchill, at a vital point in British history, stood for its courageous soul, and Mandela embodied South Africa's unitive soul. Yeah, if a Tolstoy can be seen as a particular embodiment of the Russian soul, we can say that Johann Strauss is an embodiment of the beautiful Austrian soul, or Shakespeare of the British soul, or Lao Tzu of the Chinese soul. One way of understanding soul, therefore, is by looking at a couple of examples of a Rajasic culture and observing when soul isn't present. So, for example, it isn't present when we watch some reality TV show or some blockbuster movie. It isn't present when we find ourselves being nice to someone solely to make a good impression because we want something from them, as opposed to being genuine. Indeed, if I can say that inside our hearts dwell certain sacred qualities, wisdom, truth, freedom, love, compassion, beauty, capacity for joy, then soul is present whenever we're authentically expressing or embodying any of these qualities. There's a tremendous connection between the presence of soul and the presence of wakefulness or being awake. In fact, I see being awake is the most important ingredient to allow soul to come into being. As wakefulness takes us into deeper areas, the more awake we are, the more we become who we are. And so soul is often realized when, to quote from Eckhart Tolle, we're in the now, or we're alive to the isness of any particular moment. And this is why meditation is so important. Because in meditation we quieten down and we connect to the deeper us underneath what the Easterners call our monkey ego mind jumping all over the place. In meditation, we start accessing a self that belongs to the larger self of the world. And so we begin to connect into the part of us that's not just an isolated individual, but the part of you and I that belongs to the whole. However, and this is an important point, while we all possess soul, it's not a given. We won't necessarily manifest it, and it'll stay hidden unless we consciously engage in activities designed to awaken to it. I think soul has a definite presence about it. And I've learned over the years to recognize someone who is soulful and who isn't. There's a certain authenticity or a depth or a wisdom, and it goes way beyond charisma. The talk show host may have a charming way of bewitching his interviewee, but he probably is not coming from a deep and genuine place. Because the soul person has a certain je ne sais quoi. And we experience this when we encounter soul in all the many ways. I just watched an old YouTube of Ray Charles, and my God, that man had soul in his music. His music came from the very depth of who he was. It was like he was channeling something much greater than who he was. And depth, I need to remind you, is not a mental thing. And we like to associate the word only with its intellectual ramifications and think that if we have a doctorate that we're necessarily a deep person. Folks, it may not be the case. Yup, it may imply that we are clever or intelligent, but not necessarily deep or wise, which interestingly enough is often best linked into in silence. Whenever we connect to what is true, beautiful, and real, we're connecting to soul. And again, I love Nasser's remark when he said there's more soul intelligent and food for thought in the drumbeats of a traditional tribe in Africa than many a book of modern philosophy. And I agree. In my own life, I think one of the deepest conversations I ever had with anyone was with a shaman in Mexico who spoke none of the languages that I spoke. And we said nothing, but our beings conversed at a profound level that was filled with love. I felt unconditionally seen, heard, and understood, and a sacred space pervaded the environment around us. And I contrast this with when I was at university. I met many philosophers who were very clever people, and I found what they said interesting, but I think few of them had soul. What soul does, if it's powerfully enough focused is that it activates soul potential in the environment around it. In other words, just as we can catch cold, so you and I can catch soul. And I'm going to give you a powerful example of this in my own life. I am a very mediocre blues guitar and harmonica player. I don't have much voice, and there's not a lot of soul in the way I play or sing, and it's not being modest, it's a fact. Those of you who are seeing this tape who have ever heard me perform will vouch for that fact. However, on my 50th birthday party, I was privileged, as a cabaret I offered my guests after dinner, to play some blues songs with one of the great virtuoso blues musicians of all time. He happened to be a friend and close neighbour, and it was a great honour that he came to my 50th and agreed to play with lowly little me after dinner. However, and here's the point, as soon as we began playing, I experienced myself being caught up or brought up into his soul field. Yeah, I think we can say that soul emanates a field, a sort of field of consciousness. And for that hour that we played together, or that my friend graced me with, I felt I understood the blues in a whole new way, and I observed the songs began to play themselves from deep inside me, and for the first time I began to grasp their true spirit, because I was being temporarily lent his soulfulness. In other words, because of my friend's radiance in this area, a new presence came into my own playing and singing. And so for that hour, I became quite literally transformed into a blues man. It was a great experience, and a small example of the kind of transformational magic that soul can bring. And I realized that if I were to spend more time hanging out with my friend, that I might slowly morph into being a musician as opposed to someone who occasionally tries to play a few songs. And I think this is probably why many of the great artists and craftspeople learnt their trade by first being apprenticed to a great master, because the important thing is being able to imbibe the sacred space out of which the master operated. But, sadly, in my case, the master left at the end of the evening and the effect began to fade. But it was still a tremendous experience, and little echoes of new possibilities still live on in me. I also find that when I visit sacred places like Chartres Cathedral, or when I meditate over a great masterpiece of sacred art, I find that I'm temporarily ensouled, as such art reflects the perfection and goodness of life, the harmony and order reflected in the cosmos, and its beauty enables me also to connect to that part of myself, a part that we all have and yet spend so much time covering up, which is also beautiful. Similarly, if we visit an ashram where a great spiritual master lives or has lived, we can experience soul in abundance in the same way that we can when we listen to Beethoven or Bach. Bach's B minor Mass for me is utterly transcendent. I'm also a small collector of tribal art. And when I feel into the soul of those pieces which sit in the office where I work, I have a couple of them just behind me here, all of which store the soul presence of their sculptors, I feel very happy. In my last book on awakening the heart and spiritual activism, I wrote in a chapter on spiritual help substances how important the spiritual master is, and how important it is that we seek out situations which ensoul us, which provide a context for us to connect with soul, and how important it is that we avoid situations which do the exact opposite. Because the more we're able to touch into our soulfulness, the less we feel like sort of miserable, sort of little wretches that so often we feel. And in fact, there's a quote by Jean Houston. She said, "We're all born Stradivariuses, but we're raised to believe we're plastic fiddles." I love that. And I think the more we know and connect with our own soul, and the more we know and connect with soul outside of ourselves, the more we experience our beauty, our transcendence, our soulfulness, and the less we feel we're a little plastic fiddle. It's people who have to be pumping themselves up all the time, who are people who feel they're little plastic fiddles. I think of Trump. Really, he feels a little plastic fiddle. That's why he's got to have all this paraphernalia about him, all that pumping up, all those dreadful behaviours of his. It's all a cover-up. What Trump plays is a game of ersatz soul. Instead of being, he does. Instead of having inner beauty and inner strength, he tries to cultivate it all outside. In fact, I say here, I noticed all inflation or pumping ourselves up comes from the illusion that we are that wretched little plastic fiddle. Whenever we strongly link with soul, we're no longer part of the world of scarcity, fear and separation. We enter a domain of great fullness, and abundance pervades us. Now, I love being in wilderness spaces, and a lot of us do. Why do I like taking myself for hikes to desolate parts of this island of Mallorca? Why am I so drawn to deserts and mountains? I think it's because they're empty of all the trivia and contamination and dross that our rajasic society fills us up with. And when we're in these big empty spaces, untouched by so-called civilization in inverted commas, we're offered an opportunity to let go and unburden, to allow ourselves to be fed by pure soul food. And the extraordinary revelations that can occur for us in the wilderness are revelations of soul. It was from there that Yahweh spoke to Moses from the burning bush, and where Jacob dreamt of the heavenly ladder where he could make his ascent to God. Soul, therefore, is the divine dimension of life. When soul speaks to us, and it does so in many, many different ways, it's essentially the voice of God communing with us. I prefer to say that we connect to soul rather than to our soul. Oh, you are, not our soul, our soul. Because I think only one soul is present in the encounter, and it has outposts everywhere. And I felt this on a particular hike a few months ago when I went and sat in a place on the mountainside overlooking the ocean, and I watched the sun go down, and I connected to a very profound space of peace inside myself. And I had the experience that this quality of peace that I was experiencing was not mine, but it belonged to life, and it was sitting there waiting for me to enter its orbit. And then, as I sat and I watched the sun go down more strongly, the experience slowly morphed into joy. Now, how was this possible? Nothing had happened externally in my life to bring this about. But then I realized that if we give space to listen to the deep, still voice inside us, or we allow ourselves time to go beneath the surface of our ordinary, everyday awareness that occupies so much of our time, that we start connecting to that domain inside us where soul lives. And then we can say that we're touching a sacred space. And the point about touching sacred spaces is that it's not just a whole load of New Age claptrap. The point of touching sacred spaces is that they're eminently healing. And the reason, and I made this point at the start of this talk, that we feel so full of anxiety and pain and feel we don't have enough, or others have more than us and we need a bigger house and we'll only be happy if we get exactly the right woman we want, etc., 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 is because there isn't enough soul, is because we're not connecting to that part of us where we feel connected with the world. We feel connected to the larger world. And when we do, we feel a kind of divine sense of satisfaction. But I stress once more that unless we put time and energy into consciously cultivating this aspect of ourselves, gradually discovering more and more about souls, which for each of us is different. I think we all have a different quality of soul, or different qualities in that part of us that connects to soul. If we don't do this, it's as if we don't have a soul. Matthew Fox, a true priest, he was excommunicated from the Catholic Church because he talked about the divine feminine, and he talked about joy and celebrating life and fun and radiance, as opposed to suffering on the cross and penance and all those negative things that we get in our religions. Wonderful Matthew Fox. I was honoured to have studied a long time with him many years ago, said in a book called Original Blessing, which I really recommend, I'm sure it's still in print. He said, we don't have a soul until we become a field where God is working his compassion. I kind of love that. Or one could paraphrase that and said, we don't have a soul until we become more surrendered into that place where the force can be with us, or the force is able to work through us in a loving and compassionate way. So the question is not about discovering whether we have a soul, because we do, but the question is living a life that gives space to out it. In other words, living a life where we not only focus all our work on earning our outer living, but also we spend time in earning our inner living, in giving the soul part of us more and more space to come into its own, so that more and more soul can come into all the things that you and I do, our relations with other people, our friendships with other people, the work we do, the everything in our life, so that we can be a giver of soul in more and more areas of our daily life. Now, Sri Aurobindo, the great Indian sage and mystic, he put it as follows, and by the way, I have something that I just discovered the other day. I'm a great fan of Sri Aurobindo and his teachings, and I just discovered the other day that when I was at university, I lived in the same rooms that Sri Aurobindo had lived in about 50 years before me. And I wonder if any of his sort of sacred space was left there and had permeated me. Actually, I think even if there had been, I wouldn't have been able to recognize it at that time. But anyway, Sri Aurobindo said this, and it's important, this quote: "As the crust of our outer nature, i.e. our wounded ego, cracks, as the walls of separation break down, the inner fire burns in the heart. The substance of the nature and stuff of consciousness refines to a greater subtlety and purity, and the deeper psychic experience becomes possible in this subtler, purer, finer substance. The soul begins to unveil itself, manifesting as the central being which upholds mind and life and body. Soul takes up its greater function as the guide and ruler of our nature." And that, I think, is the point, that you and I are challenged to live a life where more and more we're led not by the values that inspire our dear Donald Trump, but by the values of soul. Again, I think Trump is a great example. He has as much soul inside him as anyone. It's just that he's got enough distractions that he's never had to delve that deep. And probably, if the poor fellow falls from grace, as it seems right now is what's happening to him, and he's not going to be elected, he may go through a crisis and discover that there's more to life than owning big buildings and being a billionaire. Anyway, there is a thing called the soul wound, and I'm just going to talk about this, because there's a certain inevitable tragedy in our lives. that befalls us the moment that we're born, whereby, while we all have souls, soul is inbuilt into us, unless we have very evolved or saintly or soulful parents, because we're born into a culture that is primarily Rajasic and unsoulful, that Rajasic culture takes hold of us and starts moulding us, and we learn to forget who we are, and we learn as we grow up to disconnect from the core of our being. And Wordsworth, in Intimations of Immortality, he said this: "Trailing clouds of glory do we come from God who is our home. Shades of the prison house begin to close around the growing child." In other words, we're born out of a soulful state and we come into the world, and somehow we forget, we learn to forget that who we really are is our soul. So, in other words, if our parents or primary caregivers are centered primarily in their personality, ego selves, and have little conscious soul life, the existence of this higher order reality never gets reflected back to us, and so it never gets ignited inside us. As in order for this to happen, we need someone outside of us as a mirror to reflect it back to us. In other words, if during the course of our lives we never encounter any further catalyst to coax our souls out of hiding, they may well remain dormant inside us until the day we die, which sadly is the case with many of us today. Or as one Sufi master once put it, it's tragic that so many people die without ever having been born. That is, without ever learning to graduate into their soul life. And this is the great wound of modern man, the soul wound, the wound of our being disconnected to who we are, that lies behind all our emotional and psychological traumas. Yes, as I stressed earlier, visits to areas where the presence of soul is deeply concentrated, or close encounters with soulful forces, such as falling in love, or seeing the birth of our child, or playing blues music with a master, it can do a lot to open us up. However, if the experience is not understood properly and effectively integrated, the effects will only be temporary, and whatever degree of soulfulness will have been present will evaporate once the external catalyst is no longer there. However, my friends, it's not simply joyful experiences that may coax our souls out of hiding. Tragic ones may do so as well. And in my last book, again, I devoted several chapters to exploring the many different types of crises that we go through, all of which potentially can activate a deeper awakening inside us. And I stress the fact, and I stress it even more today, that these crises are not only worsening, but they're occurring in more and more areas of our own personal lives and in more areas in the life of our world. And I think it's becoming less and less possible to avoid being touched by them. The great playwright Christopher Fry beautifully summed up what's happening in the world today in a play entitled A Sleep of Prisoners, and I want to quote a few verses which are relevant. The frozen misery of centuries cracks, breaks, begins to move. The thunder is the thunder of the flows, the thaw, the flood, the upstart spring. Thank God, our time is now when wrong comes up to face us everywhere, never to leave us until we take the longest stride of soul man ever took. Affairs are now soul size. Wow. What I see him saying is that the old story is now crumbling and falling apart, and our planet is consequently becoming more and more transparent, with the result that increasing numbers of people are becoming more and more aware of more and more areas of their lives that are soulless and don't work. And this is having a waking up effect. In other words, more and more of us are realizing that unless we deal with our problems in a new way, they ain't gonna go away. What the line affairs are now soul size says to me is that the traumas our planet are currently going through are now so colossal that they're actually beginning to activate this deeper soul awakening. And suffering, if it doesn't destroy us, yes, there are certain crises that are too big and they can destroy us. Like the terrible shock bombing of Iraq in the Iraq War, Operation Shock and Awe, to shock the Iraqi people into surrender. Terrible, terrible, terrible. It nearly worked. It didn't quite, but many of those beautiful people in Iraq were shocked beyond the point of no return. But if this doesn't happen, suffering can be an awakening catalyst. And there's a particular crisis which we may go through in our lives, and it may well be that our planet as a whole may have to undergo it in the not too distant future. And it's a crisis called the dark night of the soul. Sorry, I just lost my place for a moment, if you will forgive me. I just lost my place. Just lost my place. Oh. Right. I'm nearly there. Okay. So, when we encounter the dark night of the soul crisis, what happens to us is that everything joyful suddenly is extinguished. We feel no hope. We feel there's nothing to look forward to. We feel all is dark, and we're overcome by the most terrible despair, as we feel everything in our lives is black and hopeless. And what happens in this crisis is that we're going to a deeper level, where encountering all the attributes that ordinarily we try to avoid ever having to see, and we try to prevent others seeing as well, like our selfishness, our anger, our resentments, our greed, our manipulations, our destructiveness, our dishonesty, our vanity. We're having to see them for what they are. So when plunged into a dark night of the soul crisis, what becomes brilliantly illuminated is everything inside us that stands in the way of our being able to access the soulful, the truly soulful part of us. In other words, the cat is let out of the bag, and it's terribly painful. But it's also extremely healing, for when something is revealed to us or made visible, it offers us the opportunity to do something about it. It offers us the chance to work with these dark and damaged parts of ourselves, in the knowledge that so long as they're not transformed, so long as we stay with our rough edges, we'll simply continue to remain rooted on our old stucknesses and limitations. And it will be very hard to disengage from our attachment to our old story scenarios, because our old stories feed off these edges. Our old stories, the Rajasic and Tamasic society, it feeds off our resentments and anger and vanity and greed and resentments and dramas. As such, this is not a crisis of soullessness, but it is a crisis, but it's a reflection of soul beginning to come alive inside us, and what its light is doing is it's reflecting down and allowing us to see everything about ourselves that is soulless. We're able to see our faults for what they are, so that they're no longer invisible to us, so we're no longer in the dark. In other words, the light is shining into those crevices into our beings, or exposing all the skeletons that we've hidden away in our cupboards. It illuminates all that is most desacralized about us, all that stands in the way of our standing in our full purity and abundance. In other words, the way to live a more sattvic existence, we cannot avoid confronting and not hiding away from our own dark shadow. And the dark night of the soul is a crisis that awakens the shadow of the Rajasic and the Tamasic in us, so then we can do something about it. And so this crisis is a great gift. And if we have the courage to enter our own dark vortex and confront our vanity and destructiveness and nastiness and manipulativeness, or whatever are these parts of our nature that keep us locked into a more superficial existence, if we have the courage to confront and stay with and let them, as it were, marinate inside our hearts, a gradual transformation will happen. and these parts will begin to become purified, because there's a natural alchemy that happens whenever we have the courage to look at and stay with our greatest fears and terrors and demons. However, that's what I'm going to say on the emotional and psychological front, but there's another thing that we also need to look at. We need to ask ourselves, how was it that our society became so rajasic? Okay, we're born into a world and soul seems to play a game of hide and seek with us, and we need to lose touch with it in order to find it. But how come our society has become so soulless, so superficial, so violent, so denuded of truly spiritual qualities? What's happened? How have we lost soul? Why has this come about? And I think there are social, political, and religious reasons for this. And the social and political perspectives relate to the growth of our rational capabilities and our moving into a patriarchal world, ushered in on the shoulders of a religion emphasizing our fallenness, how bad we are, how distant we are from God, as opposed to our blessedness. In other words, the idea that there's a divinity and goodness of being inside us. And I'm going to say a little bit about this, because the truth is that soullessness has not always prevailed. Our culture has not always been rajasic. Thousands of years before the advent of religion, despite the fact that humanity's mental powers had not yet come into expression, primitive people in the old shamanic cultures were naturally conscious of the grandeur of nature and felt very much that they lived within a sacred order, where they felt aligned with a higher reality that ensouled all of life. Consequently, there existed a deep reverence for life, and man felt himself very connected to the natural world. The rise of patriarchal religions, however, saw this containment within a sacred order gradually fall away. And in Plato's era, the world witnessed a strong moving away from nature and a movement towards reason and knowledge. Our egos grew up, losing their deep instinctive sense of connection to nature, as a result of which this domain of life gradually became increasingly desouled and hence open to be exploited. And the shaman, who saw soul in all things, became replaced by the hero or conqueror who didn't, but who saw his role as being to overcome obstacles and fight dragons. So now the world entered a veil of suffering, and a god was born who was feared and seen as cruel, rejecting and judgmental. And aren't the qualities of rejection and judgmental so pervasive in our Rajasic society today? Anyhow, we're in the 4th century, but in the 4th century, St. Augustine's doctrine of original sin severed humanity even more from soul and fixated humanity into a consciousness of scarcity and separation by imposing on us the belief that we were somehow contaminated by sin and therefore separate from God, not part of God, separate from God, and this led directly to the scientific reductionism that is so prevalent and so integral a part of our desacralized world today. In other words, what happened then was Christianity stopped being a religion of love and became one of punishment. And Adam and Eve were granted dominion over the earth. In Genesis, God told them to subdue it and have power over everything on it. And this attitude, being the Bible, which sadly many corporations still subscribe to today. In other words, the more the left brain or reasoning side of us evolved, the more humanity's soulfulness became suppressed. And the more the voices of women, who by their very nature are instinctively closer to soul than us men, the more these voices became silenced. Judaism, Christianity and Islam all now possessed a zeal to conquer and subdue, and they needed to find hate objects to demonize and project their dark side upon. In the 16th and 17th century, we saw the Protestant Reformation dedicated to eradicating Catholicism, and this resulted in 95% of the artistic heritage of the Middle Ages being obliterated, which was a huge rape of England's soul. Imagine. Francis Bacon's influence at this time was very strong. He told us that we needed to control nature, as in itself it had no purpose and was not part of the wider cosmos. And this, of course, led to a further desoulment and a further shift away from humanity participating, and this is important, in the being of things, to one of desiring power over things. So science, therefore, took the view that animals, nature, and man had no soul and did not belong to a sacred order. And therefore, what has no soul may be tortured and abused. Thus we saw a shift towards a transcendent above the world and punishing male patriarchal deity, completely separate from the forms and structures of life. God no longer existed within matter. Then in the Industrial Revolution, we saw a further movement away from soul towards a worshipping of the machine, and where everything that was non-rational was viewed as nonsense, and where consciousness was perceived as merely a product of the physical brain, and any so-called mystical experience was regarded, and it still is in many scientific quarters today, as an aberration of the brain chemistry. In other words, manipulate the brain, and anyone can have the visions of a Saint Teresa or any of the great mystics. Prince Charles, in his book Harmony, talked about this a lot. And he, in particular, with a view to nature, and he said, we've come to function today with a one-sided materialistic approach that is defined not by its inclusiveness, but by its dismissal of those things that cannot be measured in practical terms. Very good, Prince Charles. So, our challenge, my friend, is to find soul. And it seems to be that God has intended it that we have to play a kind of game of hide and seek with the divine, because the divine has hidden him, herself, inside us in order that we could be motivated to find it. And this is our challenge, because if you and I came into the world and knew that we already were soul, that we already were one with all that is, that we already were a divine, sacred being, there would be no work to do, there would be no journey. So the divine has set it up somehow that a game of hide and seek needs to be played. And God hides inside you and I to see if you and I will wake up and want to be moved to discover that we are not this sad little plastic fiddle, but that we really are the abundant Stradivarius. So, my friends, see the journey to find your soul, and again we find it through opening our heart, because I think soul speaks to us most through our heart. See this journey as the most important thing that you could be doing with your life. Thank you very much.